Everett Hale thought inheriting 3,700 acres of untouched valley would mean silence, freedom, and a fresh beginning. Instead, he arrived to find survey stakes, bulldozers, and luxury signs advertising homes on land his family had owned for generations. At the center stood Marlene Voss, the HOA president. Everyone quietly called Karen, calmly claiming she had already sold 42 lots. She laughed at Everett's deed, called him a trespasser, and ordered deputies to remove him from his own property. But Marlene had overlooked one sealed boundary map, one missing signature, and one federal easement capable of turning her entire development into evidence of fraud overnight. Everett drove his old pickup truck into the Silverbriar Valley after more than 15 years away, following a phone call informing him that his uncle Franklin Hale had passed away and left him the entire valley. Franklin had lived almost as a recluse, refusing every offer from resort companies and mining outfits who wanted a piece of his land. In Everett's memory, the valley held nothing but open meadow pine forest, 2 creeks, and a stone house tucked beneath the mountain. When he finally crossed the old cattle gate, none of that memory matched what stood in front of him now. A freshly paved road cut straight through the meadow-orange survey stakes lined up in rows, and a massive billboard read, Silverbriar Estates exclusive mountain lot starting at $850,000. Excavators rumbled near a temporary sales office, and on a glossy marketing map, at least 42 parcels were already stamped sold. Everett stopped his truck beside a cluster of workers and asked who had authorized any of this. The site manager told him they worked for the Silverbriar Estates Homeowners Association and that every acre had been legally purchased years earlier. Everett calmly pulled out a copy of his uncle's will and the county-certified deed naming him as sole heir. The manager didn't believe a word of it and called Marlene Voss directly, and within 10 minutes, a white luxury SUV rolled up the new road. Marlene stepped out in a tailored blazer designer sunglasses and a thick folder clutched under one arm, looking Everett over as though he were a distant cousin trying to scrape together an inheritance claim. She announced that the Homeowners Association had controlled most of the valley for 6 years, and that Franklin Hale retained nothing more than the stone house and a few surrounding acres. Everett asked to see the transfer documents, and Marlene produced a photocopy bearing what looked like Franklin's signature. One glance told Everett something was wrong because his uncle always signed in blue ink with a middle initial, and this signature was black ink with no initial at all. He said nothing about it yet, only warning her that before she sold another lot, she should make absolutely certain she actually owned it. Marlene laughed in his face and ordered him off her private community, and when he refused to leave, she called the sheriff's department and accused him of criminal trespassing on Homeowners Association property. 2 patrol cars rolled into the valley while Marlene stood with her arms crossed, fully expecting Everett to be handcuffed and dragged off the very land he had just inherited. Sheriff Grant Holloway climbed out first, along with a junior deputy, and Marlene wasted no time pointing at Everett and accusing him of breaking in, threatening workers, and interfering with a multi-million-dollar development. Everett stayed calm and handed Grant copies of the will, the deed, and the probate court's certification of ownership, and Grant examined every page carefully before turning to Marlene and asking for the association's own title. Documents. She produced the same photocopy she had shown Everett earlier, insisting the transfer had been signed 6 years prior and filed properly at the county land records office. Grant realized both parties were holding paperwork that looked legitimate on the surface, and without a court order, he refused to make any arrest. Marlene demanded he enforce the association's bylaws instead, and Grant flatly reminded her that Homeowners Association rules did not override state property law. In front of the workers and prospective buyers touring the site, Marlene declared loudly that Everett was a con artist and warned everyone not to believe a single word out of his mouth. Everett asked one simple question in return, wondering why the parcel numbers on her billboard didn't match the numbers recorded on his uncle's original deed. Marlene hesitated for the first time because the marketing map used a new numbering system the association had invented themselves. While Franklin's deed described the land using a decades-old federal survey system, she quickly claimed the numbers had simply been updated after the parcels were subdivided, but when Everett asked to see the county's official subdivision approval, she refused, insisting he had no right to demand it. Everett turned to Grant and explained that in Montana, subdividing a property this large into more than 40 separate lots required an environmental review infrastructure assessment and public hearing before county commissioners. Grant asked whether the association had ever obtained that approval, and Marlene claimed every relevant record sat in the office of Duncan Crowell, the county's land records supervisor. Grant allowed Everett to remain at the stone house, but ordered both sides to stand down until ownership could be properly verified through the courts. The moment the deputies drove away, Marlene ordered a temporary fence built across the private road leading up to the house, a petty gesture meant to remind Everett who she believed was really in charge. Everett returned to his truck, retrieved a survey-grade camera and handheld GPS unit, and spent the rest of the afternoon documenting every stake, every piece of equipment, and every serial number he could find near the construction site. Marlene mocked him from a distance, telling him that a handful of photographs could never defeat a homeowners association with millions of dollars and an entire team of lawyers behind it. Everett replied that he had no intention of defeating the association at all. He only needed to prove it had never owned the valley to begin with. That night, walking the northern boundary with a flashlight, Everett found one of the new survey stakes driven directly through an old stone marker, dating back to 1912, and buried just beneath the disturbed soil, he uncovered a silaman, faded metal disc, stamped with the seal of the Federal Land Management Bureau. Grant stood beside his patrol car for a long moment after Marlene's SUV disappeared down the new road, watching Everett quietly gather his documents without a trace of anger on his face. He had seen plenty of property disputes over the years, but something about the composure in Everett's voice told him this one ran deeper than a simple family disagreement. Before leaving, Grant warned Everett that Marlene had a reputation throughout the county for winning fights through sheer volume rather than through paperwork. He advised Everett to document everything, keep copies in more than one place, and never assume the county's own records were beyond question. Everett thanked him and said that was exactly the plan he already had in mind. Everett spent the rest of that night walking the old boundary lines with a flashlight and a printed copy of the original survey coordinates his uncle had once shown him as a boy. He located 7 separate stakes the association had driven into the ground, each one shifted anywhere from 300 to over 900 feet from the true property line. None of the shifts were random, because every single one pushed the boundary deeper into land that had always belonged to the Hale family. Back inside the stone house, Everett searched Franklin's old study and found most of the drawers emptied, a locked cabinet pried open, and file boxes sitting completely hollow. Someone had clearly gone through the house before Everett had ever arrived. Behind an old landscape painting hanging crooked on the wall, Everett discovered an envelope addressed to a man named Nolan Mercer, and inside it was a photograph of Franklin standing beside Nolan next to one of the original boundary markers. On the back, in Franklin's own handwriting, was a warning that read, "Do not trust the new map, the eastern line has never moved." Everett tracked down Nolan Mercer, a retired land surveyor, living roughly an hour outside the valley, and at first the old man refused to say much, wary of being dragged into a fight with a powerful homeowners association. But once he learned Franklin had passed away, Nolan finally opened up and admitted that 6 years earlier Marlene had personally hired him to survey the eastern section of the valley. Nolan's own survey concluded, the association legally controlled only about 84 acres near the main road, nowhere close to the entire valley. Marlene now claimed as her development. He recalled Marlene asking him to redraw an old hiking trail as if it were an official legal boundary, and when he refused, he walked away from the contract entirely. Months later, a different survey map surfaced bearing what looked disturbingly close to his professional seal. Though Nolan swore he had never signed off on any such document. He still had his original field notes locked away, but he knew they wouldn't be enough on their own if the county's official records had already been altered to match Marlene's version of events. When Everett asked who could possibly change official land records, Nolan gave him one name without hesitation, Duncan Crowell. Nolan poured 2 cups of coffee and admitted he had carried a quiet guilt for years, wondering whether his refusal to alter the survey had somehow made things worse for Franklin rather than better. He explained that after he walked away from the contract, Marlene never approached him again, which he now realized meant she had simply found someone more willing to cooperate. He described Franklin as stubborn but fair, a man who had personally walked every fence line with him during the original survey and who knew the valley's terrain better than anyone else alive. Nolan still had his field notebook stored in a fireproof cabinet in his garage, filled with handwritten coordinates, elevation readings, and dated photographs that no fabricated map could easily replicate. He offered to testify if it ever came to that, telling Everett that a lie this large eventually collapses under its own weight. It just needed someone patient enough to keep pulling at the threads. While Everett met with Nolan, Marlene called an emergency meeting with everyone who had purchased a lot, insisting Everett was attempting to extort the association and promising the project would continue exactly as planned. A few buyers grew visibly uneasy since many had paid between $600,000 and well over $1 million for their parcels without ever receiving an individual deed. Marlene assured them the paperwork was simply moving through processing, though in reality the money had already been funneled into accounts controlled by Victor Langford's development company. Everett and Nolan returned to the valley to remeasure key boundary points and found that one of the original stone markers had been torn from the ground with heavy equipment and buried beneath a mound of loose dirt. As Nolan raised his phone to photograph the disturbed site, a dump truck suddenly appeared and deliberately released a load of gravel directly over the exposed evidence. Everett stepped in front of the machinery, forcing the driver to stop before the marker was completely buried, and moments later Marlene arrived, declaring that no survey work could take place without prior authorization from the Association. Everett held up his phone, showing her the clear image of the federal boundary seal he had photographed the night before, and for the first time since he'd met her, the confidence on Marlene's face visibly cracked. She turned away quickly, pulled out her phone and made a call that Everett happened to overhear just enough of. She told someone named Victor that Everett had found the marker, and that they needed to get inside the stone house and retrieve the old maps before he found them first. Everett had already noticed signs that someone had broken into the stone house earlier, so he installed small cameras at the entrance, the study, and the equipment shed before nightfall. He also reached out to Tessa Whitmore, an attorney